Okay, well, good morning.
Morning.
And we continue in our series on the 12 steps that show Christianity to be true, again based on the book by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And just to review very, very briefly where we've been so far, we looked at the first two steps, and now we're on the third step, which says that a theistic God exists. And so what we're going to be doing, what we did last week and today and next week as well, is looking at the evidence for the existence of God. Well, remember, our approach is with someone who is not a believer and gives no authority to the Bible. And so our approach is, how do we meet this person on their own ground? We could say that God exists because the Bible says so. And of course they simply say, well, that's just your book. I mean, that doesn't convince anybody. Muslims say that their God is true because of the Quran, because of their holy book. And so what we want to do is meet this person on their ground and see how much progress we can make. And it turns out there's quite a bit. Last week, we looked at the what's called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And very briefly, says that everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. And we talked about how if you have absolutely nothing, then nothing is all you're ever going to get. But we have a universe that exists, and so we have to explain where that universe came from. And science tells us that the universe is not eternal, that it had a beginning. Science tells us that. And all scientists in the scientific world basically agree with that today, that the universe had a beginning. And so if...
even reluctantly.
Yeah, that's right, even reluctantly. But if the universe had a beginning, then you have to explain what the cause or the where did it come from. And so there aren't too many options when it comes down to who created a universe. And so it indicates very, very strongly that there's a God. I really like that song, and I can't tell you how long it's been since I've heard that. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Hugo Montanez. I think that's his name. Anyway, today we're going to look at another argument for the existence of God, which is sometimes called the argument from design, or more technically, the teleological argument. And we want to just explore that and see how does that lead us to conclude that God exists from science, basically from science. So I want to start this morning with, and at the top of your page, according to Francis Bacon, who is considered by many to be the father of modern science, science is a search for causes. That's the job of science, is to find causes, and science does that by setting up experiments and looking at things and discovering what causes this particular phenomenon to happen, what causes a seed to turn into a flower. And science studies that, and they understand that. And so science is a search for causes, and it turns out that there are two kinds of causes. There are what we would call natural causes. Those would be the unintelligent forces of nature. They cause certain things to happen. The wind, the rain, earthquakes, lightning, all these kinds of things are causes for certain phenomena that we see. You might say that the cause for a seed becoming a flower has a lot to do with rich soil, proper amount of water, and then it grows, a proper amount of sunlight, those kinds of natural causes for the seed becoming a flower. But the other kind of causes that we see are intelligent causes. Certain things that we look at, we can conclude require an intelligent cause. For example, I hold this book, this Bible, up in my hand. Now this Bible, because it exists, it had to have a cause, it had to have a way to come into existence. But when we open it up and we see that there are words in here that make sense, it says that there has to be an intelligent cause behind that. Certain things require intelligent causes, and we're just kind of intuitively we know and we understand that. So those are the two kinds of causes that scientists look for when they're trying to determine what caused a certain thing. But there's something that's very interesting that's happened now in the 20th and 21st century, is that science, the philosophy in science generally speaking, is that we want to only look at natural causes or things in the material world. And so sometimes scientists are called materialists or naturalistic scientists. They're only looking at physical causes, material causes for things that are occurring. And the reason for that is that if you begin to say, well, there are supernatural causes for things, that you begin to infer that there's something beyond the universe, beyond the material world, and they don't want to do that. Most of them are atheists in the scientific community, and so you want to be sure that you're not going to do or say anything that might open the door for God's existence. And so it's a serious bias, but that really is the presupposition of the scientific community today, is that natural causes can explain everything. We don't need to go to supernatural causes. But the problem that we're going to find is that with this argument from design is that science is going to lead us to intelligent causes. It's going to lead us into that realm where there's something beyond the material world. And that's, again, last week, that's what the cosmological argument does, and that's what our argument is going to do today. So what is this teleological argument that we're speaking of? Well, in your notes you can see it says under Roman numeral 2, the argument goes like this: every design has a designer. The universe, and especially life itself, demonstrates highly complex design. Therefore, the universe had a designer. All right? Let me give you an illustration as to how this works with these two photographs that you see in your notes. These are photographs of two rock formations. You could be hiking in the woods, and you could come across the formation on the left. That's a rock formation. And you can conclude, well, how did this rock formation come to look like it does? And the answer would be, well, years of rain and erosion and earthquakes and flooding, all of those geological activities contribute to this particular rock formation. Does everybody get that? Come on in. Does everybody follow that? Mm-hmm. The formation on the left can occur naturally. You don't need an intelligent cause for that rock formation on the left to look like that. Now let's say you're also hiking along the woods and you look up and you see the formation on the right. I think you'd have to be in South Dakota. Where's it? Where's Mount Rushmore? South Dakota. You're hiking in South Dakota. And you look up and you see this rock formation with the faces of 4 United States presidents. Well, would you conclude the same thing about that formation as you did about the other formation? That it just occurred by erosion and the wind?
Long time.
Yeah, it would have taken a long time. Yeah, I think intuitively we would say no, that there's too much complexity and there's a message in that formation. It's the faces in detail of 4 individuals who happen to be presidents of the United States. So you would conclude that that did not get there by natural or unintelligent causes. That got there from an intelligent cause. Someone had to design that, and then someone had to go out and chisel that formation, right? There's a big difference between an intelligent cause and a non-intelligent cause. And so when we see things like design, when we see things like information, that tells us that there's an intelligence behind that. An intelligence had to have caused that. Natural forces don't have intelligence, and so natural forces are not able to create extremely complex messages or information. And that's what we see in Mount Rushmore. So we would conclude that Mount Rushmore had an intelligent design, the other rock formation an unintelligent design. Make sense to everybody? Well, how does this apply to what we're talking about? Well, when we look at the universe, what we find in the universe is that it is finely tuned. There is a tremendous amount of design in the universe. In fact, it displays far more design than Mount Rushmore does. And so, if that's true, then what would we conclude? If Mount Rushmore needs a designer, wouldn't something with more design need a designer as well? Sure it would. So the question now is, does the universe have design? And I would, again, in science today, scientists are a little bit hesitant to talk about design in the universe, because when you start talking about design at that level, the level of the universe, you have to explain, well, who or what is in a position to design the universe? And that certainly begins to open up the door for God. How is the universe designed? Well, let me just give you a couple of things. If you don't have a scientific background, that's okay. I don't either. Some of you might appreciate this more if you have a science background, but I've identified several items to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I say the universe displays design. There's a certain fine-tuning to the universe with the natural forces and all that are out there, which lead us to believe that coincidence might not be a good explanation for what we see. For example, the force of gravity is a very, very particular strength. In fact, science has discovered that if you were to alter the force of gravity by as little as 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, that's a 10 with 40 zeros after it. If you were to, that's an extremely minute number, and if you were to alter the force of gravity by just that much, the moon would crash into the earth or it would fly out into space. Nothing could be held in orbit. So that tells us that the strength of gravity is fine-tuned to a very, very particular degree in order for life to exist and in order for things to be held in orbit. At the top of the second page, I say second page, it's page 8, because I've numbered the pages from week 1. So in the end, you'll have it'll make sense, the page numbering. So the top of page 8. Says this: if the centrifugal force did not precisely balance the gravitational force, nothing again could be held in orbit. If the electromagnetic force were slightly stronger or weaker, life could not exist. Most people don't know what the electromagnetic force is. It gives us things like magnetism. But it turns out that the electromagnetic force holds electrons in their orbits within an atom. It holds the electrons orbiting around the atom. And so if that electromagnetic force was slightly changed, the atoms wouldn't hold to each other, and we're made of atoms. I mean, life, it would be impossible for us to exist. So that electromagnetic force is perfectly tweaked, perfectly fine-tuned to hold atoms in their place. It's just remarkable. If the strong nuclear force was slightly smaller, only hydrogen would be produced. The strong nuclear force has to do with molecules and atoms being able to combine together. And so science tells us that if that strong nuclear force was smaller, the only chemical that would be stable would be hydrogen. And of course, we couldn't exist if there was only hydrogen. So it's just amazing that science has discovered how precise these forces have to be in order for us to live. If the oxygen level in the atmosphere were slightly more, spontaneous fires would break out. If it was slightly less, we would suffocate. So they just have the right amount of oxygen in our atmosphere for us to be able to live. Our atmosphere filters out harmful radiation while working with the oceans to moderate the climate. So the atmosphere happens to be just right for us to have the right temperatures and to not be harmed by the radiation coming in from outer space. The Earth is just large enough so that its gravity retains the atmosphere, yet small enough not to keep in too many harmful gases. So again, the size of the Earth is just right for life. If the distance of the Earth from the Sun were altered as little as 5% either way, life would be impossible. We would either be too cold or too hot to survive. You go to Mars, and it's too cold. They're just too far away from the Sun. You go to Mercury, the closest planet to the Sun, it's far too hot for human life to exist. So these and many, many others. Science has identified over 100 of these types of things, which show that the universe is no accident. Now, you remember that modern science believes that the universe came into existence in the Big Bang. The Big Bang, when all of the matter exploded out of a little tiny point into the universe, what we have today. Now, explosions don't typically cause organization or fine-tuning, do they? It's often said that if a print shop or a printing company explodes, there's an explosion, you don't have books in final form in the end, or you don't have pages with writing on it that, you know, explain. No, you get chaos. You get bits and pieces of everything everywhere. There's no fine-tuning at all in an explosion. And so this is what science comes up against, is that if the universe began with an explosion, how in the world do we have so much fine-tuning? Why is it so precise? Everything is just what it needs to be in order for life to exist. And that's a very hard question for science. What science has to do is say, well, I know the odds might be long, but apparently, you know, you look, here we are, and so the odds must have just happened. I mean, somebody does win the lottery, you know, every once in a while. Happens to be.
And the question they don't want to ask is who caused that explosion?
Well, that's right. Yeah, we talked about that last
explosions don't
week.
just happen.
Yes, that is exactly right.
Like this school doesn't just explode. We're like, what just happened?
Yeah. Well, I've got this book with me today. It's called The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. And Lee Strobel is one of the great apologists of our time. Lee has interviewed many scientists who are Christians, because there are a few in the field, and there's a growing number of them, thankfully, in the field, who are, you know, taking a stand and saying, yeah, you know, science, we need to follow the evidence where science leads. And that evidence leads us to the existence of something far more than just the universe. In this book, Lee Strobel interviews a scientist by the name of Robin Collins. He is a physicist. And here's what Robin Collins, who, this is his field, he knows about these things. Here's what he says. It's very interesting. He says, as far as this argument about possibilities, yeah, maybe the possibilities are very remote that all this design happened. Maybe it's very small chance, but it could happen nonetheless. Robin Collins says this: if I bet you $1,000 that I could flip a coin and get heads 50 times in a row, and then I proceed to do it, you would not accept that. You would know that the odds against that are so improbable, about 1 chance in 1,000,000 billion, that it's extraordinary unlikely to happen. And the fact that I was able to do it against such monumental odds would be strong evidence to you that the game had been rigged. And the same is true for the fine-tuning of the universe. Before you conclude that random chance was responsible, you would conclude that there's strong evidence that the universe was rigged, that is, designed. So in other words, what he's saying is like, okay, you can appeal to that argument and say, oh, just chance. But that's not very reasonable. You know, in science, scientists want to be reasonable. And when you go against those kinds of odds, you are just, it literally, I invite you to try it. Go home, take a coin, and start flipping it and see if you can get heads 50 times in a row. And if you are able to do that, you come back here and tell me, because I think his math would have to be wrong. This is absolutely crazy. And if you were able to do it, you would go, wait a minute, wait, something's not right. You know, something we're being tricked here somehow. The question is, what's more reasonable to believe? What is more reasonable to believe? Is it more reasonable that the odds, such incredible odds against that, have hit? Or is it maybe a little more reasonable to believe, well, maybe there's something beyond the universe that has designed it? So that's the universe, right? Big scale, gigantic scale. The universe is so much bigger than we can comprehend, believe me. We can't even begin to understand the distances and how large this thing is. And we see design at that level. But we also see design at the very tiny level when it comes down to our individual lives and our bodies. Life itself turns out to be incredibly complex. And complexity tells us that there's a designer. Let me give you an example. Under B, it says if natural cause. That word if should not be there. Typo. Sorry about that. So ignore that word if. I try and catch these things before I print it, and I printed them all, and I went, oh no. So that word shouldn't be there. So it should say natural causes by themselves do not create meaningful, complex messages. Here's an example. Let's say Bill and Jane are walking along the beach one day on Jane's birthday. And Jane looks up in the sky, and she sees the words, "Happy Birthday, Jane," written across the sky. Big white puffy letters, right? Now, Do you think she's likely to turn to Bill and say, look at how those clouds just happened to form those words, and on my birthday, no less? What an amazing coincidence. Is that likely what she's going to say? I don't think so. Here's what she's likely to say is this: Bill, I hope the money you spent on the Skywriter does not affect how much you're going to spend on my present. Because obviously, those kind of words forming on Jane's birthday, we cannot attribute to natural causes. We would attribute that to a skywriter. We see, you go to the beach, you see skywriting all the time. It's pretty cool. So complex messages are always the result of intelligence, right? Complex messages are always the result of intelligence because natural forces don't have that ability to create complex, meaningful messages. Complex messages are the result of intention stemming from volition or desire, right? Desire is what causes a complex message. Inanimate objects or forces of nature do not have intention, they do not have a will, therefore they do not have the ability to create complex messages. But when it comes to life, we find this amazing complexity in our bodies. Carl Sagan was a very famous atheist. Anybody know that name, Carl Sagan? Okay. Very, very famous atheist. Famous scientist, but was absolutely convinced that the universe is all that there is and that there ever was, and that is all that's ever going to be. And in fact, he had a series years ago before he died. He had a series on TV. I forget what it was called. But
The Cosmos.
The Cosmos. Yeah. Did you see it? Did you watch it?
No, but there was a second one done. It was newer one called Cosmos.
Yeah. Well, yeah, his series, The Cosmos. But I remember the way that series opened up, and Carl Sagan had this low bass, voice, and he would say the universe is all that there ever was, and that they're all that there ever will be. For him, it was only the natural world. And it's interesting because the late theologian R.C. Sproul knew Carl Sagan. And R.C. Sproul had opportunities to discuss, I guess on several occasions with Carl Sagan, matters of faith and the idea of God existing. And R.C. said that Carl would never admit, where the science was leading. He just wouldn't admit, and that just shows you how strong the bias is in science against God. There comes a point when scientists are saying, we're drawing the line here, and we're not going to go past it. Doesn't matter what the evidence says, and that's how strong a philosophical or a worldview bias can be. Keeps you from following the evidence. Today there's a movement within the scientific community called the ID movement, which is the Intelligent Design movement. And it's a bunch of very sharp, cutting-edge scientists who have realized that, we can't bury our heads in the sand anymore when it comes to all of this evidence. And so they've begun publishing work, and the rest of the scientific community doesn't like it because their work is inferring that there's something beyond the universe that is responsible for the design and the origin of what we have today. And they're doing a tremendous amount of work in the field of biochemistry in terms of the cell. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But it's just amazing how the scientific community now is beginning, at least in that part, to have their eyes opened to where the evidence. And that's what they're saying. They're saying, all we're just doing science. We're following the evidence to where it leads. And where it's leading us are to intelligent causes as opposed to natural or unintelligent causes. And life is a good example. So Carl Sagan, one of the things that he has said is that the information in the human brain, if it were written out in English, would fill some 20 million books. That's a lot of books. I think I have a lot of books in my house. 20 million books. And all of that is between the ears in every single person. We have that much information in our brains. So what does that tell you? Where does information come from, right? Does information occur by accident? Does it occur by chemistry, accidentally, chemicals combining together? No. When you look down into our bodies at the cellular level, science has discovered DNA. And now, it's been so many decades now since we've known about DNA that pretty much everybody knows those initials, DNA, right? And we know that DNA is in every single cell of your body, and cells are pretty tiny. You got to have a pretty good microscope to see an individual cell. But within every cell, there is this thing called DNA. And the cell is the most basic part of life. It's the most fundamental way that you can have something to be alive. In fact, there are organisms that consist of only one cell. An amoeba, for example, would be a creature that has only one cell, simplest form of life. And even within that creature, there's DNA. Now, the DNA exists because that's the information which tells, in humans, for example, tells the cell how to divide, how to multiply, tells everything that the cell does within itself. The DNA are the instructions for how it works. Very, very complex instructions that go in there. In fact, as it says in the notes here, the most elementary form of life, a one-celled amoeba, the information in its DNA would fill 1,000 sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica if you were to write it all out. That's not 1,000 books. That's 1,000 sets. How many books are in a set of
30?
About like 30, right? So you're talking about maybe 30,000 books in the DNA of a one-celled amoeba.
Oh, gee.
That's an unbelievable amount of information, of complexity. So the question that we would raise to science is that if such a simple message like "Happy Birthday, Jane" in the sky, if that requires an intelligent cause, why doesn't a message that's as long as 1,000 sets of encyclopedias require an intelligent cause? Okay? I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's obvious. It's intuitive. We really we don't have to think about that too long before we would conclude that, hey, this is clearly an example of something having to have a design. So the question is, if you go back, science says, well, Darwin says, well, everything, evolved from an initial form of life, accidental combination of chemicals, and you wind up with a cell. And from that one cell, it began to multiply, and animals, began to develop and evolve, and all over through time, now you have all the living species on the earth. But let's go back for a minute. Let's say, if Darwin's right, let's go all the way back to that very first cell, very, very first form of life that accidentally forms on planet Earth. The problem is for that cell to live and to divide, it has to have DNA. So where did the DNA come from in that very first cell? And that DNA has enough information to fill 30,000 books. By accident? I mean, there comes a time when it just takes... That's why the name of this book is called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist." Because that's what it requires. There's more faith to believe that those kinds of things are accidental than it does to simply say, well, you know what? It really looks like the design requires a designer, and the only designer who's available at this level is God. It's just far more easier, makes far more sense to believe that there's a God who has designed all this. Just a little more detail. Again, sometimes the argument is made, okay, granted it's a long shot, all right? But like I said earlier, some people win the lottery. There's a lottery now that's like becoming gigantic again, right? I don't play the lottery, I don't understand, but I've seen on TV advertisements that there's some kind of huge lottery going on even now. And so, somebody is going to beat the odds and win it, right? So maybe scientists say, well, given enough time, eventually the right combination of chemicals could come together to form life. But what is the likelihood of a single cell being created? Granted, the DNA, I think, puts this whole case to bed. But they're arguing that maybe it's just possible that accidentally it happened. Well, what's involved in a living cell? That's the question. You got to understand what's involved here. A living cell is made up of. This gets a little bit scientific. Believe me, I'm not a scientist. Okay, so but just so that you have a feel for how complex life is. A living cell is made up of protein molecules. Okay, every cell in your body is made up of proteins. Protein molecules are made up of amino acids. okay? And each protein molecule has about 100 amino acids. It varies. The scientists would say, well, not always, but generally speaking, you could use the number 100. And those amino acids have to be lined up in the correct sequence in order to create a protein molecule. Okay, so about 100 of them have to be in the right order. And we need together, but even if you have that, then you only have a protein molecule. You don't have life yet. Okay, you don't have life. You need about 200 protein molecules to get together to form a cell. Okay, that's a lot of things that have to happen by accident. So here's an illustration. A bicycle lock. You know what a bicycle lock is? Those things you lock your bike and it has the numbers on it that you turn. In my day, there were 4 numbers. I think now they have like 10 numbers. You know, or you can imagine one with 10 numbers if they don't have them by now. Imagine a bike that has 10 digits, and you have to get the right 10 numbers in order to open the lock. If it's got 10 numbers and each number has 10 possibilities, then there are 10 billion possible combinations for that lock. That's why that lock would be very, very effective, because if someone came along and wanted to steal your bike and you've got that thing locked, they would have to go about 10 billion tries before they could get that thing opened. And that would take a really long time. So if they want to invest, you know, many, many years of their life, in fact, 10 billion would have to probably be just longer than they're even going to live. We're not going to live that long. So that's why the odds against them guessing that would be remote. It would be highly unlikely to guess that combination. But the odds against 100 amino acids forming randomly in the proper alignment are far greater. Far greater odds against the amino acid thing happening than opening the bike lock. Right? So if the probabilities are that high, are that astronomical, what's more reasonable? Here's the illustration that is given. Unbelievable. The probability of linking together just 100 amino acids to create one protein molecule by chance would be the same as a blindfolded man finding one marked grain of sand of the Sahara Desert, not once, but 3 times. Imagine that. Go into the Sahara Desert and say, there's one grain of sand that we have marked in a special way somewhere in the desert. And we're going to blindfold you. You're going to walk in, you're going to pick out a grain of sand. And we're going to see if you happen to pick out the grain that we marked. I'd say the odds against that are remote, happening once, but he'd have to do that 3 times in order to come close to the odds that it would take for a protein molecule to come into existence by chance, by accident. So you can see that where this is leading, that once we begin to understand the science, where is it pointing? It's pointing to the existence of something outside of our material universe, who has created this and who has made this happen. We can't simply depend on in the very beginning, and the sloshing chemicals and the wind and the rain and all accidentally forming a protein molecule. Easy for Darwin to say in the 1800s, because he didn't know all this stuff. He didn't realize how complicated a cell was. In his day, he could see a cell look like a little black blob. He thought, oh, well, blob could form pretty easily. See, so without the scientific knowledge today, then we could be misled, and we could think, yeah, okay, it accidentally happened and life accidentally evolved. But now that we know so much more science, we realize that that is just an impossibility. Just impossible. So the blind faith of the atheist is not due to lack of evidence for a designer, because the evidence is impressive. The reason atheists reject the designer is because they do not want to admit it. It's just a bias that they have. It's a decision that they've made, that they're simply not going to allow that to be a reason for the way things are. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do scientists, with all the evidence, fight as much as you say they fight against intelligent design? Is there something larger going on?
Yeah, I think it's a spiritual battle. Yeah, I think it comes down to a spiritual thing. I think that if you are adamantly against belief in God, then you're going to dig your heels in, and you are just simply going to refuse to budge. And I think that's what the theory of evolution has been able to do. And by the way, we're going to look, I believe, next week at the theory of evolution, and we're going to see some problems with that theory. But that's all they've got. And so they're going to cling tightly to it. Because if they let go, then you're opening the door for the existence of God, and that's just something they refuse to do. It's the will. Ultimately, I think it's a matter of the will. It's not the evidence. It's not the science. It's the will. That shows you how strong the human will is. If you don't want to believe in God, then you're going to close your eyes off to everything that leads to Him. And that's a very, very sad thing. I love this last illustration. And I'll finish off with this. The universe in our world demonstrates complex design. It had to have a designer. Who or what could serve as designer? Obviously, as we've said, the conclusion is God. But the atheist sometimes still argues, they still cling to this concept that the right combination of chemicals could come together to form life if you have enough time. And even though we've just shown that the odds against that are so remote, they keep coming back to say, well, billions and billions and billions and billions of years could happen, you know, if you have all that time. And so there's a guy by the name of Tom Hines who kind of analyzed this. Very, very interesting. He said, given, against this argument, given the enough time, eventually the right combinations could have come together to form life, his answer is there hasn't been enough time. There hasn't even been enough time for this to happen, even if you allowed for the possibility. So here's the illustration. Thomas Hines in his book Creation versus Evolution. Illustration of the time required for a chance combination of random elements to become meaningfully organized. All right? In other words, elements to become meaningfully organized in a cell to create life, for life to accidentally come together. But any kind of complex message, what are the odds against anything meaningful being organized? He says this: how long would it take 1 billion monkeys to type a simple message like Genesis 1:1 by random chance? And so here's the illustration that he sets up. Everybody knows what Genesis 1:1 says. What does it say?
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Right, one sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the message. Now that's far less complicated than the amino acids, creating proteins, creating a cell, okay? Far less complicated. It's one little tiny little sentence.
30,000 books.
Yeah, far less complicated than 30,000 books. All right, but that, he said, let's just take that one sentence as an illustration example. And so what we've got, we want to get that one sentence to come out of these monkeys who are typing on a keyboard randomly. And these monkeys have a tremendous amount of stamina. These monkeys are able to type 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, without ever taking a break. They don't have to eat, they don't have to sleep, they don't have to do anything. They are just going to sit at this keyboard and they're going to go do-do-do-do-do, and they're going to type at a rate of 5 hits per second. Okay? 5 strokes per second. 1 billion monkeys, all with their laptops in front of them, and they're just going to start randomly hitting it. All right? How long is it going to take before they would come up with the first sentence of the Bible? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So here is, and this guy's done the math. He's figured all this out, right? This is what is so wild. He says, in order to achieve a 1 in 100 chance of getting that sentence right, not that they're going to get it, but they're going to have the odds of 1 in 100, which is unlikely. But just to get to that stage, they would have to type for 120, followed by all those zeros. There's no name for that number. It's far too big. No one's ever counted. I don't know what that number would be. But that's how many years they would have to type to get a 1 in 100 chance of coming up with that one sentence. And the problem is, as the final sentence shows, scientists agree that the universe is less than 15 billion years old, and I've written out 15 billion. So you can compare those two numbers, 15 billion with the one above it, and you can see that the universe isn't old enough for those kind of odds to come about. The monkeys would have to type for far longer than the universe exists to have a 1 in 100 chance of coming up with a meaningful message. So again, just an illustration to show you how utterly unlikely it would be for life to have accidentally come into existence. What do you think about that?
The one thing I find fascinating is that your biology has a connection to technology and invention and innovation. Like the cell you were talking about that was in Cro-Magnon Man, right? In Peking Man, is the same information that's contained in you and I.
Mhm.
And I find that interesting because if you theoretical physicists look inside a cell and they see incredible complexity, billions and billions and billions of like computer code type instructions
Uh-huh.
that bring it into formation, that put it into the right part of your body to do something very amazing, very specific, and in conjunction with millions of other cells surrounding it. They all seem to they form something and work together and communicate. And so these theoretical physicists look at the functioning of some of these cells, and they say that they do things like incredibly complex factories do, incredibly complex pieces of technology and equipment, and they realize, therefore, that if your cell is like a supercomputer in power and in capacity and capability, then there must therefore be the fact that these things came into existence at the beginning of time, right? Not out of man's hands.
Yeah.
So I find that fascinating and compelling for intelligent design to be the case.
Yeah, there's no question about that. The science is just remarkable, and you talk about scientists today talk about the machinery in the cell. And when I teach this in college, I teach a course in apologetics at Pillar College, and I have a little bit more time, and I show a video animation which has been produced, which shows you the activity, and it pictures what's going on in the cell, and what you see in there are things that look exactly like machines operating. And Michael Behe, in his book Darwin's Black Box, wrote this book, and he began to talk about the machinery of the cell, and began talking about how you've got things in there that look exactly like the kinds of machines that we use, you know, in our lives, like outboard motors and stuff like that. And people begin to go, wait a minute, machinery has to be built and designed. And it just doesn't come about by accident. And we're going to get into a little bit more of this next week. We're going to talk about the theory of evolution and why that doesn't fly. And as we begin to examine some of the problems, we're going to look at some of that complexity and show that that's just can't be accidental. Yeah, so, did you have a question?
He wrote a second book to that, actually.
Yeah, it came out just recently.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah.
There was an interview with him on the Christian Outlook program. So if you go to ChristianOutlook.com,
Yeah.
They have an interview with Michael Behe.
Yeah, true. He's a biochemist at Lehigh University, and he has really done some tremendous work. And you know, and I think he's an example of somebody who is trying to simply follow the evidence where it leads. And he's looking at this and says, machines, machines. They don't form by accident. So you gotta follow it where it leads. So it's an amazing field, science, and again, it gets back to this question. You know, so often people have in their minds this battle between science and religion, that these two are very opposite things. And the religion people, they're just concerned with myth and legend and, you know, God things, and science. That's where we get real knowledge. But that's just simply untrue. Science points to the things that religion stands upon. And think about it. It should. If God exists, and God really did create the universe, doesn't it make sense that there would be all this design? Doesn't it make sense that all of these things happened regardless of the odds? It just makes sense that if God is there, this is what it's going to look like. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. It's yeah.
The scientists can find themselves in great jeopardy if they speak out about God and religion and intelligent design versus the physical universe and what they can prove. They could lose their jobs.
Well, many have.
They have.
Yeah, there are universities around the country that will not stand for professors talking about this kind of thing, talking about creationism or intelligent design even.
Yeah.
Because the minute you start talking about intelligent design, everybody goes, "Oh, wait a minute, you know, that's going to lead to God. We don't want to go there." And there have been many actually documented cases of professors who said, "Well, I just want to present this in my classroom because it's science," and they actually lose their jobs.
There's a documentary called Expelled by Ben Stein. Oh, that thing opens up a lot of things. It's amazing how many bad reviews that thing has, even though it's true.
Yeah, Ben Stein did if you haven't seen it, it's highly worth watching. It's called Expelled, No Intelligence Required, where Ben Stein goes around interviewing a number of these university professors who have been either chastised or, in some cases, lost their job because of their stand saying, look, you know, I'm just presenting this in the classroom because it's science.
Yeah. And there was another recent one which World Magazine talked about. It's a Christian publication, and it talked about how one scientist even had his name removed from a Wikipedia article.
Yeah.
Because he all of a sudden started to question evolution, and the person just took it out.
Yeah.
Like, nope, this guy didn't exist.
One of the biochemists at
Seriously.
who's part of this intelligent design movement. His name is Doug Axe, and Dr. Axe is an amazing biochemist, and he's doing work with proteins. And what proteins do is once proteins form, they fold into particular shapes, and that shape gives them the function within that cell as to what they do. And he's done a tremendous amount of work and how the folds happen and how these proteins work. And when he first started out, he would have his work published in general, scientific journals, and they were happy to, publish his work. But then they realized that where he was going with this was to say, well, we have to explain how this incredible, activity is happening. And then all of a sudden they were like, well, wait a minute now. And then they refused to publish his work anymore once they realized kind of the avenue he was on. So he actually had to start, he and a number of other scientists started their own scientific journal so they could publish their findings to the scientific community because they were basically locked out because of where they
Where
they
is
were doing.
tolerance, right?
What's that?
Where is tolerance?
That's true, yeah, right. Yeah. Well, it's not to be found there.
Some of the textbooks that I looked at as a kid were false representations to fill in gaps, to show that evolution could explain how we came from primordial soup to a lizard-like thing, to a fish-like thing, to a fish that wanted to reach some food on shore, so it eventually developed legs.
Yeah.
And they showed these sequence photos, and many of these things have been proven to be patently false.
Sure.
And so I think science should be about truth, seeking truth.
That's right.
And in many instances it can become political, it can become agendaed, and have its own outcomes that are more about, I think, building up its own self-importance, and rather than finding answers and truth.
Yeah, in fact, in that film that Will referenced, Expelled, No Intelligence Required, they interview people on that side of the argument, and they are just, it gets pretty nasty, this battle at times. Accusations going across, that these people, these intelligent design people know nothing about science, they're idiots. It just gets...
arguments they'll use to silence them.
The what?
Ad hominem arguments.
Ad hominem, yes, the argument's the person. I mean, it's almost a name calling, it degenerates to that kind of thing.
I saw, Glenn, a perfect illustration of intelligent design. During my newspaper days, I went to the Ford plant on Route 1, and the way I started I watched a car being made, and it starts with a barcode, and the barcode just advances along, and it tells what color to make it, how many doors, this and that, and it was all based upon this intelligent design, this code, which is what we are. We're like that, and at the end, a car produces.
Yeah.
Not by mistake, by intelligent design and then application of the design.
I think Bill Gates is on record saying something to the effect that the DNA, the organization, the complexity, the messaging in our DNA is far more complex than any computer code that's ever been written. And computer codes are quite advanced, as you say. A simple barcode is unbelievable, but in some of these computer codes that send a rocket to the moon and back, I mean, can you imagine the complexity? And Gates himself said it's nothing compared to what's in the DNA.
And so complex that it took the Human Genome Project a whole long period of time to sequence
to find out what's all in there. Yeah.
So, well, if you want to take the natural approach, you can always say, well, then if you take two cars and smash them together, you should have a whole brand new vehicle.
Well, I wouldn't recommend it, but try it. Yeah,
If you
so.
collide them fast enough.
So anyway, this is the argument from design. I think it's a very powerful one. And again, we're building a cumulative case because given the cosmological argument last week we talked about, the universe had to have a beginner, a cause. And now not only does it have to have a cause, but you have to account for all this incredible design in it. And so again, those are very powerful arguments that only God, the most reasonable answer is that God exists. Why not admit it? So, alrighty, well, we're out of time, so let me close this in prayer and then we'll go on in. Lord, we thank you so much for what we looked at this morning. I thank you, Lord, that you have created this world, this universe, and you have left your fingerprints on it. There is so much design. There is so much evidence, Lord, that points straight to you. You have been gracious in giving us this pathway to have confidence that you are truly there. And I just thank you, and I pray for the minds who would shut this evidence off without looking at it, without examining it, that they would be open to follow the evidence where it leads. And so, Lord, I pray that we would be encouraged, too, with what we heard today, and that our faith would be increased as well. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.